Yeah, thanks. I wanted to welcome everybody for joining us. My name is Scott Rennick. I'm the owner publisher of the Climbing Business Journal. And it's really rewarding to do these route setter conversations. Our origin was before there was a CBJ, there was a routesetter.com that Mountain Health ran, and then he evolved it into CBJ. And route setting has been a really core focus of the journal from day one. And I personally, I was a commercial and comp setter in the late 90s, early 2000. It's something I'm really passionate about. So we're really excited to have these. Thanks for being here. I guess without further ado, I'll introduce our hosts of the session. We've been doing these. We've been fortunate and privileged to work with Foxman, McCarthy, James, and Justin Wright of Vortex Routesetting. Both of them are between them. There's decades of route setting experience. They both have led teams that are responsible for route setting for multiple facilities. They've been doing this for a long time. They're members of the committees of the CWA, the route setting and work at height committees. And a couple of years ago, this is where we met. They launched some data collection and analysis about workplace conditions and compensation for route setters, and it's really been awesome. It's like this labor of love. They've been doing that kind of basically as volunteers, and it's been really awesome. So it's been awesome to work with them. They've lined up everything, so I'm going to hand it over to you, Justin Foxman. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I guess I'll start it off. We've got a couple other people in the room you might be familiar with, but if you're not, just in case, I'll give you some spark notes. First up, we've got Flannery here. They are a USAC L4, IFSC L3, over a decade of setting experience and over 2 decades of climbing experience. They've set all over the world. Also joining us is Tonde. He's maybe one of the industry's sort of greatest thought leaders, starting route setting all the way back in 1995. He's set for national and international competitions all over the world. Currently, he's taking this call from Australia, so it's actually tomorrow there. So if he wants stock tips, let him know.
It's the future here. I can tell you about it.
Yeah, for sure. So welcome, both of you. I'm psyched to talk about some grades.
Yeah, so I figure I jump in real quick and kind of like lay out some ground rules. We're going to go over like the problems pretty quickly. What we have found is in rooms full of route setters, it's really easy for us to just kind of like portal into complaints. And so if we want to complain, I have like a standing offer to grab a drink with you the next time we are in the same town, and we can be like, man, grades, they're the worst. But that's not what this session is for. This is a session for like finding productive solutions on how to approach difficult problems. Like if it were easy solutions, we wouldn't be here, but we're here. So the problems that we're gonna like move past pretty quickly is like, we know that everybody wants to complain. We don't need to talk about it a whole bunch. Everybody thinks that they're right, and there's lots of complaining. Done. We are going to spend a little bit more time talking about how grades are fundamentally flawed and subjective, and there's no clear right answer. So we're going to kind of be coming back to that throughout the rest of the conversation. But let's, for everybody in the room, try to keep things more positive and more productive so that we don't just leave feeling bummed.
All right, so I think I want to start off by like maybe laying out a couple of questions that we're trying to answer. I've got a bullet point list. I'm just gonna go through them and then we can kind of tackle them however it makes sense. So first we've got, how do we approach conversations about grades within our route setting teams, sort of like behind the curtain, if you will? How do we teach our communities about grades so that we get less of those complainings? Is there a grading system that works best? And what is it, or why? And how does the way that we sort of approach grading affect the communities that are climbing in our spaces?
So kind of to start it off, looking at how ego plays into this, because there's kind of no way around it. So here's where we toss it over to you guys. How can we address the ego that is inherent in our own experience in a way that is productive when we're talking about grades, both for ourselves, for our route setting teams, and for the community? Just a little question.
A little one. All right, Tonde, do you want to start this one off?
Sure, I can take that one. I actually, in preparation for this, did a little homework, and did some reading up about the ego. And what occurred to me is that if we want to throw this word around so casually, I think we shouldn't be taking the common sort of conversational definition of it. I think it probably is useful to dig a little deeper and figure out, what does it mean? Like, what do we mean when we say ego? Like, it's just pulling the blanket to oneself. I feel this grade should be this, and it makes me look better if I do this, or but I think there's some sophistication and some complexities to the psychology of understanding how we relate to grades. And whenever I teach route setters, I always try and tell them, remember that you're experts. You make climbing. And as such, I think it's important that we try and sort of educate and understand these psychological concepts a bit better. Why do I get so upset about like a grade at the level that we're talking right now, not as a climber, but when we get into those tiffs with colleagues or with gym owners or whatever about what the grades are. And there's moments when I've had those conversations and it becomes irrational. I'm like trying to defend this certain position, and then a couple of hours later, I'm like, why did I make such a big deal out of this one thing? And I think answering that question, knowing ourselves really well as climbers, as individuals, as human beings, and actually figuring out, interestingly, how the other elements of the Freudian sort of structure, ego, what is it, super ego and id. I'm not a specialist on any of these, but I do think reading up on those and having a better understanding of this word we're throwing around off the bat, it's kind of cool. It's kind of helpful. It clears a couple of things up, because at the most basic level, whenever we talk about ego, there's something that like snaps to who we are really personally, and how we grew up, how we relate to climbing, how it relates to our identity. And especially as makers of climbing, if we don't have a clear understanding of sort of why are we rambling about ego, I think it could be cool to sort of figure that out, and then figure out how we expect other people who climb in our gyms to be able to connect with that. Maybe a little opener. You've got anything to build on that, Flan?
Definitely. So, the thing that's interesting about the ego is this.
Hang on, Flan. Is it just me, but you're super choppy?
Yep,
I'm going dark. Is this better?
that is better.
Okay. Well, it was nice to see you all. Do one of the
We'll
black
miss
box.
you.
One thing that's interesting about the Freudian ego is that it kind of gives oneself relation to the other. Like it does create like a box that you exist in. And in that way, it's a really important tool, both for like existing in the world. Like it's, I think in a Freudian manner, like impossible to be egoless, but also it's a really important box for talking about route setting grades, because so much of climbing is this ability to progress between what are maybe grades, but maybe are just like challenges that you're exposed to. And having that like sense of progression is something I think that draws a lot of people to the sport. And then when you think about that with regards to ego, then you need to like relate how progression relates to like your sense of self and your sense of like self-identifying and like how you think of yourself as a climber. And without having this like sort of format of grades, I could imagine that it's like quite difficult to do that. So I think it's easy to be like, as route setters, like, yeah, this is ridiculous. Like this is sort of like an illogical conversation. But there is something that's like really integral to the sport of climbing as we know it, that is grade. And I think it's like really important to think about like what that means to us and what that means to the customer and what that means in a more like grand scale, like Tonde was saying.
Yeah, so listening to kind of what both of you have been saying, I think that, that concept of ego, Tonde, you put it really well. It becomes this catch-all phrase, but it's not necessarily, at least from my perspective, an inherently negative thing. It's just the perspective that we are approaching, anything in our lives with. And I think it gets super touchy within climbing because, like, as you said, Flan, that box is important to us as we measure our progression. But because it is subjective, we can't look at just like how many miles we ran or how many pounds we picked up today. We're starting to like define our perspective through this number that's on the wall or in the guidebook. And the conversation gets muddied because there isn't just like that objective measurement, and we are still experiencing it from our own perspective. And so like looking at how grades function within a gym, how can we start to like have a conversation about why they're important in a way that doesn't like mitigate people's like specific perspectives or like denigrate anybody's like opinions?
I mean, it's tricky, and I think maybe when we move to this like a bit more of the solutions, there's some strategies in doing that. But I guess when we talk about ego, the science says that ego basically tries to negotiate through the reality principle, our desires. Oh, I want to be the person who flashed this boulder, and reality. I'm nowhere near the right level to flash this boulder, or how come this girl who I don't know who she is just flashed this boulder, all these things that kind of play into identity and personality and give us that internal feeling of like, I don't know, disappointment. Or so this idea that the ego is supposed to negotiate based on the reality principle, I think maybe that's where a first step is broken, is that in that reality, in the supposed reality that we're existing in, grades are inherently flawed. I think this is something that has been documented a lot over time. Who are the people who were putting those first grades on? Who decided what the systems were? The John Shermans of the world, all these people who developed grade systems all over the world, most often were pretty athletic, pretty socially comfortable white men. That's the bulk of it. And this is not a racial comment. It's just more about the physical, who they are. They were athletic. They were already strong. They had a lot of time on their hands. They could dedicate themselves to this passion. And as a result, they did things through their own lens. Like, this feels really easy to me, therefore I'll call it V0. Go try climb V0s in Joshua trees or some of those old crags, and it can be quite shocking. So that's one of the broken things. When I started setting very seriously in say bouldering project, when I was there, one of the things I realized is V0, the meaning of what V0 is, has to be redefined, because the people who are climbing V0 today are just really different from the people who called something V0 historically. Like, they're not gymnastic athletes. They're just people off the street who work in an office all day on a computer, and they come in and they want to climb the easiest thing possible. And that inherent flaw never gets corrected, really. It's like we just operate with that inherent flaw is always there. This is what the grades are. This is what they're supposed to be. And in our process of trying to get the grades right, it's about trying to align with that system that we learned somehow, somewhere, wherever our local crag was or wherever our introduction to grades was. And although we all here agree that grades don't work, and daily in our sets, we ask each other this question: so what grade do you think it is? What grade should we put on it? We continue to act as if those grades are real. And I don't know, the ego does this thing where it kind of like, it can ignore rationality when it suits it comfortably. And I think, yeah, understanding that mechanism and recognizing, okay, this is what's happening. This is why it feels off kilter. I'm looking through a lens that's broken and it's not supposed to align. The problem is, what do we replace it by? Because we want another system of measurement, and yeah, and that leaves us in a stranded spot, generally arguing and trying to prove that, look, I can do it really easily, which is not good evidence.
So
Yeah.
something that you just said, Tonde, kind of made me think about like this inherent challenge. You know, how do we take those conversations and adapt them or change them? Like we're having conversations during forerunning and, you know, just with our teams in general constantly. How do we reframe those conversations away from like the quote unquote right and wrong, this versus that? And like what ways can we, you know, use, because like I don't see a scenario where we're going to deviate from grades, right? Like so many people identify with this thing that is outside for those who climb outside, you know, whether it be an actual V grade or a range of V grades, depending on how your gym sort of decides to portray them. No matter what, they're tethered to a thing that the customer is going to then, you know, look at. So I think I want to start that conversation of like, how do we talk internally with our route setting teams about, you know, maybe why we have grades, or how do we help guide the discussion about like where it should be, or how we create that well-roundedness within a circuit or something like that. Do either of you guys have any thoughts about that perspective?
Most definitely. I think that this is, you know, right when we get right down to it, sort of the crux of the problem is like, how are we having these internal communications in our setting team? Because when you look at route setting, it's like essentially us communicating with the clientele from like behind the wall. We don't have to be there in order to communicate these ideas. But what we do need to have is sort of like a united front as a route setting team as much as possible. And obviously, like depending on the team, that's not going to be the case. But that we can give that idea in a like clear and well thought out way to the customer. So I think that there's like a lot of sort of questions that you can go back to, almost using them as like a toolbox to get on the same page with the setting crew. But I think the most important one of those questions is just like, what purpose does your gym serve? It's more than just a climbing gym, right? It's like a third place for people to hang out. Is it mostly a third place for people to hang out, or is it mostly a training center for people who climb outside a lot? Like, are you focused a lot on younger climbers? Are those younger climbers experienced in climbing, or are they new to climbing? What does your clientele look like? Where do they want to go? Like, there's all these questions. Where does your gym fit in the ecosystem of other gyms in your area? And when you have like a better idea of what the answer is to those questions, I think it's a lot easier to start saying like, okay, what do we need our grades to do then? How can we use the grades as another part of that toolbox to communicate with our clientele? Tonde, you got any other questions to be asking?
I second that entirely. And I love, Flan, that you use the word ecosystem. I think that climbing gyms at the moment are a relatively poor ecosystem as a whole. Like if we look at all of them together, there's really for me personally, too much trying to do the same thing. When I go to different crags, I expect grades to change based on the idea that I need to adapt as a climber to the type of climbing that's being proposed there. So I go to Waco, I go to Fawn, I go to Castle Hill in New Zealand, all places that have very strong characteristics to the climbing, very powerful like ideas, and how my climbing and my ability relates to the climbing that is there is going to define how well I can tick certain numbers. So if I spent my whole year on the board, just pulling on tiny little crimps, things will go a lot better in Waco than they will, for example, in Castle Hill, which unfortunately I'm close, but I haven't been to yet, but has a reputation. First of all, it's limestone, poor texture, and relatively complex movement. Being able to pull harder on a crimp won't help me there. Therefore, what my tick list looks like in one crag and the other might be completely different. And I think that idea and that relationship is really rich, is really interesting. But climbing gyms, I feel like everybody's trying to find the climbing. What is the climbing? What is the bouldering we need to do? And we don't do this here. We don't, you know, there are billion climbing movements that I just never see in climbing gyms. And one of them is almost like, it's almost a caricature of what climbing has become today. Trad movements. Trad is, you know, like 90% of the climbing literally in the world is like trad climbing and trad movements, trad specific movement. We're talking about cracks, we're talking about laybacks, we're talking about just having to do a series of movements that are associated to trad climbing. And very few of those movements ever make it into climbing gyms because they don't fit a certain label or what we expect people are going to like, or it's painful, or, and I'm taking, again, a very easy to explain example, but we can go in depth into this. And I feel like we'd be having less of an issue if gyms tried to have more personal climbing. We can come at it the same question from a different angle as business. As a business, if you look at the restaurant business, there are a lot of different types of restaurants. Like you can go to different types of, like it could be family restaurant, who caters to late night restaurants, breakfast restaurants, the type of food. There's so many different levels of variety. How is it in climbing? We have like 3, 4, like bouldering gyms, there's rope gyms. Oh, wait, bouldering and rope gyms. Ooh. And it's just very small, the ecosystem. And then the idea within those boulders, we all use the same hold brands, the same volumes, the same circuit ideas, the same, what does that guy talk about? The RIC thing. All these ideas just keep piling on top of each other again and again. And I would like to see more diversity, like people trying to present, saying like, we're one team. What is the climbing we want to make to present to our community? And I think that it would be nice if gym owners were open to that idea, because I know a lot of route setters don't have control beyond certain limits. But yeah, and then route setters trying to push the climbing that they want. This leads me to the idea that the conversation within the route setting team is guided by the type of climbing we're trying to present to people, or the audience we're trying to connect with. And I've used this this analogy before as a means of provocation. I ask my setters, when they ask me what grade should we put on this boulder, I ask them what lie will be the most beneficial to them, because we're lying either way. Right? Even if we try our best, if we start with the idea that grades don't work, and then we go ahead and pretend, oh, this is a V4, that is already like, it's already dissonant. There's already, that's the root of the argument is already there. But we go ahead and do that anyway. And then we argue about this grade that we put on arbitrarily because people are unhappy because their experience is negative on the boulder or whatever. And we defend this grade that we know is based on a flawed problem. So I'm like, what lie is it? Which one is going to be the less harmful? Which one is going to promote the desire to try harder, to step up, to even if it's in the form of provocation? Because all I'm looking for is for my climbers to engage with my climbing, to try things that they're not used to trying, and if I can tell them a lie that makes them go, you don't think I can do what? And they want to come up and try that move, I'm all for it. So it's a bit delicate, it's provocative, but I feel like there's an element there that we have to acknowledge. Even when we're trying our very, very best, as soon as we put a number on and say, this is what it is, there's no way 100% of the people who are going to climb on that boulder are going to agree with that. And when I make that statement, you're like, well, of course. Yeah, sure. Nobody should. And then we go ahead and argue, yeah, but we thought that it was easier than this one and harder than that one. And we thought the footholds were a bit da-da-da-da, and we rationalize it. So to close a long parentheses, developing diversity, putting identity into the climbing and not trying to make it general and pleasing and vanilla helps keep that edge on and justify the coherence between the grades amongst themselves. I'll pause.
I really like what you were saying about diversity in that. And I think that that's such an important part of like what rock climbing means to all of us on this like really deep level, and also something we talk about a lot from like a business perspective. And I think that that really comes in too of like what does it look like when you're having that conversation with setters, and who's part of that conversation? Whose voices are being like amplified and whose voices are being sort of like silenced while you're having that conversation within your team? And why is that happening, right? Is it like the most experienced setters are having the opportunity to like tell you which lie which I also really like to put on the wall? Or is it the least experienced setters who are having like a say at that conversation? And I think there's really good arguments for both of those people having a really equal piece of deciding what that quote unquote grade is going to look like for that gym. Because everyone's invested in your gym culture, everyone's invested in that gym ecosystem. But people have different flattenings of grades, right? Like as we are approaching our projecting limit, whether or not that's in a grade or just a style of movement or something like that, you have a deeper understanding of what that movement looks like. And that can be expanded to a route or to a boulder problem. But as you get further away from that limit, your understanding of that movement flattens. And that happens on both sides, right? If I'm climbing at my limit, I don't understand what it's like to climb like easier stuff. And I also don't understand what it's like to climb like much harder things. So thinking about whose magnifying glass you want to ask when it comes to which boulder or which route you're talking about. Because other people, like different people's magnifying glasses are going to take other things into account. And that's like, that has to do with experience, but also has to do with body type and style, and even like lived experience and ability and size. There's all the kinds of things that really like validate people's own magnifying glasses to that degree.
Definitely, and I think that's a really good point. Looking at having that diversity in, strength, size, experience on your team so that you're able to find perspectives that are going to align a little bit with each piece of your community. Because like ultimately that's who we are, route setting for, is the people who are coming to our gyms, and that's who we're trying to communicate with when we're putting grades on things. I want to move us to how we have the conversation with that community, because we've been talking a little bit about like how we have it on our internal route setting teams. Now, how do we have it with the community as a whole? But I also want to check in with like everybody who's in the room to see if there's questions or comments, to make sure that we're talking about the things that you came here to talk about, because we can have conversations all day, but if it's not what you're looking to like chat about, then what's it worth? So yeah, kind of opening up the floor to other humans.
Yeah, happy to field any questions.
Well, it seems like we're nailing it.
Success.
Or confusing people.
That's the other option.
Topic.
Well, we can check back in again in a minute or two. If you also have like thoughts or feelings that you want to put in the chat, that works too. But our time is our time. So if nobody has thoughts, then we'll keep moving along. So the community conversation. How do we talk to the audience that we're setting for in a way that doesn't feel combative and that feels productive and all of those good things?
Well, I think we maybe need some courage to maybe challenge this idea of grades. I guess maybe we can start not at the end. Let's start at the beginning. How we currently do it is somehow each gym does it differently. Some of us use V grades, some of us use the circuit grades, which group grades together. Others use their own in-house system. One way or another, there's some use or some way basically to navigate the gym, because let's also acknowledge that as problematic as they are, they do have a purpose. I know from my time climbing, say, alpine routes, I was kind of glad when I'm about to get on a 16-hour sort of mission to have some gauge, some kind of idea what level of trouble I'm going to get into myself technically. Like this is fundamentally one of the purposes of grades. And before it became a pissing contest between climbers about, who can do the harder thing, there was a functional reason for those grades. And I think that is still alive, which is guiding people towards things that they can manage, or that's going to fit with the moment they want to climb, a warm-up, a project. And so having some indication of what that is, how much we're going to be challenged is valuable. And figuring out basically how you want to get people to choose that. It's like, okay, here is a bunch of climbing in this gym. There's no labels to understand or identify what it is. How can I give you some kind of a map or some kind of a reading to navigate this whole space and figure out, okay, I want to come into the gym and jump on my project level right away. Bad idea, but if you want to do it, how would you do it? And the answer generally comes back to whatever this system is. So it's pretty important to think of route setting in two components. And this is how I always think about it. The making of the climbing that I want to bring to a certain community, which includes understanding what that particular community likes and enjoys. And also, what is it that I, as a route setter and a creative, want to add and bring into their experience that they probably wouldn't encounter otherwise. For the sakes of an example, we can talk about the toe hook move, we can talk about the bat hang, we can talk about coordination movements, just trends that float around in climbing. Maybe they don't exist in this one community and we want to introduce it. How do you do that? And then the other half of it is the presentation of the climbing. What we tell climbers, how we label it, what is the tag, what is the system that defines what to do. To give you an example of how this articulates, whether you have a gym that chooses to use circuits or not, I personally always advise route setters to always use circuits internally. The reason is the circuit covers, say, 3 grades, V3, V4, V5. And I want to think in that band, what am I proposing to my climbers? What are the moves that are there? What are the teaching points? What is the level? What are the things that are being presented? Whether I then actually set those boulders in color or tag them all together or not, I can do all that work on the background and then just put grades on every boulder, and they just stand as individual boulders and they're not a circuit, but you still know as a route setter or a route setting team what it is you are offering to your beginner climbers, mid-range climbers, top range climbers. And you're telling them these are just these numbers. This is what I think this is. And they're not grouped together in any fancy way. You don't have to climb them one after the other, nothing. But for yourself and for your team, it's like, what are the beginners? Is the climbing we're giving the beginners too much? And you can look at that statistically. You can look at that in the gym. There's a way to identify it and to make corrections to it accordingly. So there's two ideas, that there's the world that we make the climbing in and we make the proposal, and then the communication to the climbers, which includes posters, the tags on the wall, the whatever videos you're going to do on Instagram to explain how the system works. And you have choices there. And there's multiple choices in both sides, and how those things connect is as many layers to create more comprehension or more understanding for your climbers as possible. Maybe I'll give a breather there. And maybe
Yeah, I'd like to. Sorry, go ahead, Justin.
Go ahead. No, it's fine. Go ahead. I'll jump in after.
Just thinking about something that you, Flan, had said earlier, of who is having the conversations in the gym. And we talked a little bit about it from that like route setting perspective of, are we having the most experienced or the strongest or the least experienced? Do we find that there are groups of members that we hear having conversations about grades, either more or less loudly than other groups of conversations? And how can we start to pull more people into that in a way that kind of promotes just a feeling of having stakes in the conversation?
A really interesting point and something I was about to bring up. But we talked a lot about having this conversation, and so far it seems like we've been having a really one-way conversation. We've been like downloading information into the customer. And I think there's really something to be said for taking that time to be receiving the information as well. And I've totally been there on like almost every commercial crew where there's always this one person who's just like won't stop telling you what the grade should be, and it makes me not want to have the conversation with anyone and whatever. But I think that it is a really interesting question, and it's definitely like community specific, but how do we bring people into to the conversation about grades who aren't seeking us out to talk about it. And almost in the way who are seeking us out to talk about it, invited into some of the conversations, because I think they can really like bulldoze that space for. And as I said, I think it's really community dependent, but things that I've really enjoyed is like walking up to the quietest person in the gym and just being like, hey, what do you think about the grades? Or like, what do you think about grading generally? Because I think that as route setters, and we are experts in our field, we're kind of prone to thinking of customers as like, I got a message from Fox that I'm still choppy and I don't know what to do about it, except I'll talk slower.
Keep rolling. We got you for now.
Yeah, so route setters are experts, but there's also the sort of this idea that I've seen myself do, and I've seen lots of other people do, that's like negating other people's lived experiences when they walk in the gym. Like that person loses their personhood when they walk into the climbing gym and they just become a new climber or like a Gumby or whatever. But really everyone in their life has a lot of experience with like abstraction. They have a lot of experience with like things being variable difficulties and understanding how their skill set fits into them. Just as like, even just like parallel parking, right? As you're driving down the street trying to find a place to parallel park, some people are like, yep, I got that spot. I'm gonna nail it. That fits into my abilities. And it'll be like as you're moving 20 miles an hour or whatever. And other people will be like, yep, that's a little bit more than I can handle right now. So I'm gonna go find something else. So giving people that like grace or understanding or just like autonomy to be like, I can handle that or I can't. With even like less of this almost being talked down to when we come into a climbing gym. So I think, yeah, really going out of our comfort zones is like people who are working behind the wall and behind like this like veil of obscurity and just like going out into the community and having sort of these conversations that we're having right here with just a rando at the gym and trying to find a way to connect it to something in their life, or connecting to something else in your life creates a really interesting conversation.
The most interesting.
Yeah, I really like the idea of this two-way conversation. Well, so I work for a gym chain in Seattle called Edgeworks, and while I'm not like necessarily here as an advocate in that role, I can still speak to like some of the things that we're doing there. We just opened a gym that's like 2 miles away from another gym. So we opened a bouldering gym that's like, you know, a 10-minute walk effectively from this like 30,000 square foot location. And one of the tasks that me as the director of that facility is to try to like make these grades at both facilities like the same. And if I look at one facility, it's like full of steep climbing, and has this like historic nature of being like the sandbagged gym. And now we have this new opportunity that is like bringing new customers. It's like the terrain is completely different. It's you know, more slabs, more low angle. Like we designed it very deliberately to balance the steepness of the other facility. And so even though the team that's route setting in both facilities is the same, the perception of the difficulty at one gym or the other is completely different. And so I'm looking at this as an opportunity to sort of educate the community about how those grades can feel different, but actually be the same, or vice versa, feel different. And, you know, I've been tasked and sort of challenged myself to like just have lots of conversations to really break apart what grading even is, right? Like, well, have you been climbing at our original facility for the last 10 years and you're super good at climbing on like crimps in the overhang? And now I'm asking you to do this novel challenge that is like a walk across on a slab with really slopey feet that like with almost no hands. It's like, yeah, you have not been doing that. So therefore it's probably going to be harder. Does it necessarily mean that it's a harder difficulty than the thing over there that you're good at? Like that's not necessarily true or untrue, but it's like a thing that we have to think about. So like challenging the community to hold grades very loosely, and sort of really dive into like, oh, well, are you good at that specific thing? Then it's likely that you're going to feel like it's a little easier. And sort of unpacking that in a conversation and really just pulling that curtain back so that the community sort of gets a sense of like, hey, this is what the route setters are talking about. This is like maybe a little bit of that version of like why we assess and label it the way we do.
Well, and I think
Yeah,
that
I don't know where I was going
conversation Like, I think that that's a healthy conversation, like kind of going back to ecosystems where that relates so deeply to that outside climbing experience of understanding that grades are something that are somewhat nebulous and you have to approach them differently in different spaces. And so trying to foster that health within our like little microcosm of our climbing community in our indoor gym, in a way that helps kind of like grow the conversation outside of the gym. Um, so what's the solution? Should we just get rid of grades or have circuits? Is there like a system that is the best system that solves all of this?
I think clearly not. That would have been figured out ages ago. I do think there is a system which is actually getting rid of the grades completely. My fantasy right now would be a gym that I could walk into and just like a crag, there's nothing there. I actually make a point of when I visit a crag for the first time, not looking at guidebooks, not looking at videos. And I like the discovery and the desire of climbs that I discover and I see to just be like emotional. And obviously that comes with, I mean, the possibility, usually the best lines are grades that are beyond me. And in truth, in my life as a climber, that's been a huge motivator for progression in climbing. Like one of the reasons I've wanted to get better as a climber, one of my motivators is being able to go to a crag and just jump on anything I want. Just like, this is what I want to do. So I do think it would be cool to have a gym that had no grades, that if somebody were brave enough to try that and build a community from the ground up with this idea that it's like grades or difficulty is just a conversation, like just the same as you go to the crag and someone says, oh, you're trying this, you should try, there's another really good one that's around the same, it's over there. And yeah, I think that would be, I think there is actually value in trying that. I do think the grades will sneak their way back in somehow, even if it's just through people calling things something, or because ultimately we do need some way to navigate. But it would be interesting to experiment. The other
I think
idea,
that's,
sorry,
oh,
go
sorry,
ahead.
Tonde. Oh, I thought you were done. My apologies. So I think one of the things that I think about when you kind of speak to this is like, you know, this great idea of grades versus circuits. I feel like um, circuits maybe are, you know, you can make the argument with better or worse, but circuits expand that individual grade. So maybe it's like less arguing of is this V4 or is this V5 or what have you. But I feel like what it does is it just sort of changes the conversation to be like, is this a pink circuit or is this the blue circuit? You still have that comparison. You just have like three targets in between instead of one. So I'm sort of just curious, like if you know, at what point can we just continue to expand the circuit to the point where there is like just one, it's just the gym, right? It's like the circuit is just this location,
Yeah.
versus it being like, you know, snapshots of different difficulties or challenges.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. There's I mean, for those who know the Japanese system, which is based on I guess martial art belt system, there's a nice idea about how each step is like you're learning technical proficiency. And then once you reach a certain level, there's just variations. It's like the Dan system. Everybody's a black belt. Everybody knows how to climb. And then there's just an understanding that you're better at certain things and you master more things. And so how you think about difficulty is slightly different because it basically is broken down into two parts. Become a proficient climber. If you're not a proficient climber, then there's parts of climbing that are not even a conversation. And once you are, then there's shades to it and nuances. And I think that's pretty interesting. But the idea that the grades could disappear completely is challenging. As I said, even if we create a system where it's not there. I suspect that somehow the community and the need for how climbing is very performance-based would come back in. And that gets me to the circuits, because what I like about the circuit is, although it does little more than just grouping grades into bigger bands, what it does is it offers a different way to experience climbing that's not based on performance. Climbs flat circuits. And having grown up in Font, the idea that you just go out on a Sunday for a climb, and the objective is not to climb the hardest thing that you can, but just to stroll through the forest and climb 30-some boulders. And when that becomes as powerful an idea or as desirable an experience as climbing your hardest thing, I feel like that enriches the climbing experience. And that's one of my big motivators for really buying into circuits, is that it offers a second dimension. It's not just about the hardest thing. There's a vertical option, but there's also a horizontal option, where the idea, actually recently, 2 French climbers tried to climb 100 7As in Font, which is an insane challenge. Not because both of them are double-digit, really hard, strong climbers. They climb 9As and really hard boulders. However, so 7A is not a hard grade, but doing 100 of them in a single day is insane. But it's also super cool. It reminds me of a speed challenge in Yosemite. It's one of the places where the performance is not about how hard it is, it's about how fast you go. We're shifting the idea to a different objective. And the idea that there's space for objectives that are not purely performance-based with the communities that we have is really cool. Telling people who come into the gym, when you come in here, you don't have to try your hardest all the time. You can just come and just try and finish this whole circuit and stay fit and have a good time and do some different moves. And we're going to curate this whole little story for you. It's just a little game of adventures, and nothing's going to be too extreme. You'll be able to do a few things. Others will feel super easy. And suddenly the idea that this is harder than this becomes less interesting, because it's just about getting through them. And if you can't do it, it's not a big deal. So for me, the idea of circuits, the power that it has beyond just breaking things into difficulty, is breaking that whole conversation apart completely and saying there's a second option. We can come into the gym with a different objective than harder or more, or it can just be hey, today I'm climbing the red circuit with so-and-so. We chat and we have a good time, and it's still fitness and it's still really good training. And on that second or third session of the week, you can do projects or you can do whatever. And my experience is that it raises better climbers. It makes them healthier, less injured, happier. It's more fun than hanging on little edges with weights, and it's just effective. And from a route setting perspective, it gives this wonderful opportunity to offer up a composition. First is going to be a slab, and then we're going to follow it up with a fine souffle of compression, and it's going to be followed by some chopped footwork, and this chunky layback is going to lead you into this dynamic coordination boulder, and each one is a little story, and we get to choose the chapters. And for me, this is a fantastic way to build climbing and to share it with other people, and importantly, to distract them from the idea that they just have to try the hardest thing that they can until something breaks.
I think if there's one thing I'm really coming away from this conversation with, it's the idea that grades are a sticking point for everyone all the time, everywhere. And that maybe the important thing for us to try to do is just something different. So if your gym is feeling really comfortable in V grades, or if that's something that your gym has done for a long time, mix it up a little bit. Maybe have an ungraded section and see what conversations that starts with you, within your setting team, within the clientele, within the management. And if you're feeling really good about circuits, I don't know, maybe put some ranked difficulty, slab climbs up, where they're in order of difficulty, and you try to get through all the slab boulders. But I think that one tool that we can use really effectively to address this problem and so many other problems within climbing is like the idea that it just doesn't have to be perfect right away. Like, let's experiment and try other stuff. Like, we're all here because we think that grades are, if not a problem, at least something to be talked about. We should expand that conversation and have like a lot more options of ways to describe rock climbs. Because in the end of the day, like that's what grading is like a really specific way to describe a rock climb. But we can always invent more adjectives, you know?
Yeah, I think Flan, you raised a good point of like, we're so much of climbing is about being open to failure. And if we're open to failure in the conversation and like the system being imperfect as it is, then it's just going to open up more conversations and kind of like embody the sport, you know, as a whole a little bit better. I want to open it up to the rest of the audience because we've been talking lots. And again, you guys came here to be part of the conversation. So, conversation or everybody just nailed it?
I actually have a question that came to me in the chat from Glenn, and it was concerning the idea of a gradeless gym. And he's wondering if a gradeless gym would be cool for the first few years, and would beginner and intermediate climbers find it confusing and possibly intimidating. I think they would if they are really bought into another system. They've grown up in a gym, probably all climbers who climbed somewhere else. But one thing that I learned at Bouldering Project, because I had the opportunity to work there for over such a long period of time, 8 years, interrupted with some breaks, but overall, I saw the progression of some systems and some ideas that I laid down and how they grew. In particular, how kids who started in the gym when it was under circuits and grew up to be young adults, how their perception of grades or difficulty was different, or their ability to climb was different because they grew up in this very specific environment. And I think that's what would happen, is that if we start from scratch, actually if we started from scratch with a gym with no grades, the people who already had systems would probably be lost. They would be wanting something that they always get when they come to a climbing gym, is some kind of a key to be able to understand the whole system. But then there's a bunch of people who don't know what climbing is at all, and they would come into the gym, and instead of being told from their first induction, this is the easiest thing, then this is the next hardest, and this is the next hardest, and this is how it works, to just like go out and explore. Indeed, I think some people would be turned off by the experience because it is rather overwhelming. But I think the people who would buy into that would then grow up to be quite different climbers, probably. So I would say that there's still there would be work to do in order to accompany those people and have them understand. At the same time, I think that is the evolution climbing should go through. I am impatiently waiting for climbing to mature into a sport where this binary conversation about grades, no grades, we can move past that and understand that we live in a world which has so much inherent complexity. How our personal lives, our passions, for most people in this room, interfere with our work lives and travel, and all of these things are like super muddled. I'm going climbing this weekend because I can, or because I can't, or that. And then we have to break down climbing into like two black and white things, and it has to be this or that. And I feel like it's okay to have levels in climbing, or conversations about the fact that things are uncomparable, or things shouldn't be compared, that they don't need to be measured or directly, you know, take all the V17s and decide which is actually the hardest one. I feel like, you know, another point that probably is relevant to this conversation is the grade conversation happens very, very commonly at the highest levels. So those top climbers climbing, arguing on whether this is a new level, is this a new grade, is this a new... And all of us as passionate climbers are super tuned in to that conversation, the same way we're all tracking like how Magnus Midbo is training, how Tomoe Narasaki is training. We're following and absorbing all these information. And then just seeing like, oh, this is the new Tomoa training technique. I'm going to try that. Except none of us at Tomoa Narasaki, none of us climb 45 hours a week and have specific coaches and trainers. But yet we absolutely believe that borrowing their training techniques is the right thing for us to do. And same thing with the conversation about grades. All these top climbers who are a relatively small group, people who can climb whatever, V17 these days is not hundreds of people. It's a small group of people who are all kind of in agreement, who have a lot of common reference points because they've climbed some of the same boulders. And so when they have a conversation, there's a lot of common ground there. And that conversation is a model for the conversation we have about boulders that are much easier and with a lot more people. So it doesn't work. Like those conversations do work in small groups when you look at very small number of things. A good example is a World Cup boulders. You can talk about the finals. Oh, the finals were to this or to that. 6 people, 4 boulders. We can argue about that all day and actually come to a conclusion. In a climbing gym, it's 600 people and 70 boulders. It's too nebulous. It's too unclear. So yeah, I think maybe we've said enough on that. And
I appreciate all of that, Tonde. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think there's a couple of messages in chat I'd love to highlight, just because I don't think they come through in the recording. Someone asked, what tools have you found useful to challenge a route setter's attachment to grades in a healthy way? There's already an answer. It says private public grade polling once in a while, discussions about comp styles and areas and history. One thing that I can share what I do with my teams, and I would certainly open the group to chat about it too, is I reframe even the conversation to this is my boulder versus this is like a product of the community. And so already just with that like lexicon shift, we start to talk about like, hey, this isn't yours anymore. Yeah, you might have put it on the wall, but like now the team is here to like make it as great as it can be. And I think sometimes you're gonna have to beat it into some of those route setters. But eventually through using that language and kind of being like, yeah, but it's not yours. It's for them. I think that can really help. I'm curious, there's another question in the comments that I want to jump to, but anyone else have any thoughts? And it doesn't just have to be the 4 of us talking.
Something we do that I have found helpful is having regular sets where we don't put grades on stuff. Usually it's like a featurey thing where we're setting low density, but I've been toying with the idea of, hey, we're going back and forth on this. Let's just put a generic start tag that doesn't have a number on it on the wall. It's not, a whole gym that's no grades, but if we can't agree, why do we need to put a grade on this one? So
We've done a
that's something
similar thing. We've had like V question mark tags that just very simply like, don't even worry about the grade. Like just have a nice time.
I find also that climbers just try harder when they don't get intimidated by like, oh, I don't climb V7, so I'm not going to try that. I'm like, if they don't know what it is, they'll be like, oh, that looks cool.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious how many people on this call have sort of that model of like hidden grades for a period of time. Because I do that at my gym too, and I think it works really well.
So I wanted to add that from 98 to 2011, the first gym that I set in, which was the one that I grew up climbing in, we had no grades for 12 years in the gym at all. And it actually produced like some really strong, well-rounded climbers. But what I asked more than anything over that time, and the reason that we never had grades, is that it created like with a lot of communication between people, because you had to kind of convey to someone that maybe you noticed was climbing a similar level to you or something. There was a problem that they might be interested in or a route that they'd be interested in. So yeah, everybody's guiding
Well, you're breaking up a
Oh.
bit, Rocco.
We actually lost him, I think.
He'll be back.
He will.
In the
Um,
I
meanwhile,
would love it. Sorry.
oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Flan.
Can I jump in on that next question in the chat?
Please.
Yeah, that's what I was going to do. Go for it.
Oh, nice. I read your mind. So the question is there recommendations for how to get teams to start being real with themselves and each other about how hard or easy moves are? And then with another question, how do we get team members to respect themselves or each other? Or recommendations for building the interception to feel how hard they're working on a move? This is a really interesting question, and it really comes down to, yeah, like how we're having conversations with ourselves and with each other. And I think there are a lot of like really good tools, and of course it really depends on like what the team is like and what the makeup of the team is like and what leadership looks like on that team, so on and so forth. So it's not going to be like a one size fits all answer, but I've seen a couple like cool visual representations of this on Instagram recently that can be maybe a good talking point of like the tall climber versus the short climber doing climbs, like the same climb, and just being able to watch that from a really removed perspective. Like you don't know those people, you don't know those climbs unless, you know, amazingly you're like one of the setters at the gym or whatever. But watching that just really gives a really clear perspective of like what it looks like when different bodies do the same thing. And I think that can be really enlightening to take again that ego out of the conversation and just say, do these things like look the same to you? Okay, they don't. Probably, if you're good at your job or something, you can tell that they're different. And then what are the ways in which they're different? And like how does that reflect in like your own experience? And how does that reflect in the experience that you see your coworkers having? And starting in a really like just building the foundation to be able to think about moves being different for different people and experiences being different for different people, and starting from like the absolute most like divorced from reality level to have those conversations, because it can be really hard to get into that without having like an emotional response to it. So having like just a really basic visual aid might go along. But I think you're really getting to a very hard part of communicating and route-setting teams, and that could be like a full conversation in and of itself.
mhm.
And I think some of it there, like you said, Flan, that kind of like taking the qualitative judgment of like that person climbed it well or that person climbed it poorly, and just acknowledging that they had different experiences and doing our best to empathize with that experience.
There's two things that this conversation is sort of making me think about. The first is, you know, knowing the dynamics of your team and trying to foster a scenario on that team that is very like open to, hey, what am I good at? What am I bad at? What are you good at? What are you bad at? Like knowing that like this person is hyper flexible and then they do that move, no problem. And then having someone who isn't be able to struggle on it. Like those are factors that like we should be talking about. It's like, oh, well, of course you could do that easily. Like you can actually touch your toes when you bend down, and I can't. I think the other thing that it makes me think about is just like, how does that translate to our communities? Because like how a route setter interacts with it and how we choose to grade it is one thing, but like how the community interacts with it is another. And I think challenging or incentivizing, I think this was even in chat, incentivizing your team to like observe the community that you're setting for, whether like find a way to do that, whether it can be compensation, whether it's like you choose to like all get drinks and, you know, you'll buy a beer if they hang out for 30 minutes and interact with the community. I think that could be huge. Like we spend a lot of time when we set for events watching the athletes perform on our boulders. How often do we do that at the commercial setting? And so like maybe this is a conversation with your gym or your gym owner. It's like, can you find a way to build that into the schedule to make it possible?
So we've got another question in the chat from Cameron. Any tips for newer, less experienced setters attempting to bring opinions to the table when everyone else in the group is significantly more experienced or much more / higher level certified?
As Flan was saying, it really depends on the dynamics of your team. And perhaps with so many route setters present, it's worth pointing out that in spite of our best efforts, and I speak entirely for myself as well, we just don't have the healthiest sort of space in route setting teams at times, because it's hard to have those conversations. This is one of the places where diversity can really help, like having different people and different types of people who can come in at different angles and break sort of monolithic thought patterns. And but it takes willingness from everyone. And I think the work is especially hard from the people who have the most experience, to be able to not assume that because of your expertise, you have more right. You're just not more right. And it's about listening to, and the truth is, sometimes, specifically because they have less climbing experience, sometimes those newer setters ask better questions or have a better perspective on something that is happening. And it takes a lot of strength from the part of more experienced setters, not only to, or a head setter, not only to hear that voice, but to give space and weight to that voice, and to be able to say, no, I think this is a good perspective that maybe we should lean into and follow. And I think this whole fuss about diversity, which as a person of color, like I've said this many times before, while diversity is important, I also don't want, route setting to become like a place for sort of meaningless or thoughtless desire for diversity. It's like, oh, let's just make it different because it's too many white guys is not good. And no, there's a reason for that. It's because, as Flan was saying earlier, lived experiences play into everything that we do. And those interactions are really important, like genuinely. So having women, having people who have a different lived experience, different body type, super important. People who are POC, honestly, like black people in climbing gym spaces today, it's not comfortable. Most of the time, it's not comfortable. And having a setter who knows about that and who can bring that experience to the setting team and be like, this is how I feel about it. And we started this conversation talking about psychology and talking about, ego. Again, I think there's space for those conversations to expand. And but it really depends on the willingness and the openness of everybody on that team to foster that conversation and have the ability to take decisions based on, we don't really know, but as a team, we're going to follow this avenue because it's the one that seems to make the most sense. Yeah, it's hard. We need to grow up a bit.
I think it really calls this interesting thing that the grades have created too in climbing, is this like hierarchy of skill and hierarchy of ability, where the grade that someone can climb or the grade that someone can set or whatever, the proficiency with which they do the task in a climbing gym often gives them more power than someone who has less proficiency in that task. And that there's no reason that has to exist or has to be the way that we operate as climbers or as route setters. Like, it is a community, and that community demands like a lot of different input from a lot of different types of people. And I just want to shout out too that, like, when we talk about diversity in climbing, we talk a lot about like BIPOC, we talk a lot about women, but I also just want to reach out and say that there's room for like fat route setters. There's room for route setters with like different abilities. Like, there's room for para route setters. And all that stuff is just as important to create a really good like community for a climbing gym.
Truth is, it's more fun too. Like, I found it more
Really?
enriching and more valuable to work in teams that are really flat, just putting everybody's experience on the same level. And this powerful idea, someone was asking for like practical ways is that when you as a setter are stepping up to someone else's boulder, before you say anything, ask, what is it? What are they trying to do? And support that idea, whether you like it or not. Try and understand it. Try and understand what someone else is trying to build as a climb. And your job as a team member is to support it. Of course, there are moments when that idea is out of place, is dangerous, and we have that conversation. But if it's a valid idea, and acknowledging that it doesn't fit your own climbing, or you never would have done that. Whenever I'm like, oh, I never would have thought of that, I double down on wanting to support that idea, because it definitely is external from what I'm able to do. And yeah, I think that's a good way to sort of navigate, yeah, sure, they've been setting 2 days. I've set with setters who've been setting 2 days, and they set bangers, absolute bangers.
Straight up bangers all the time too.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
And yeah, things that when you've been setting 25 years, sorry, and your brain is just like tracks of running and hearing the same conversations and seeing the same trends, and it's really hard to see other things. And when somebody does come with another thing and it splashes those tracks, I'm like, let me go that way. That's interesting to me. I want some of that flavor to come into the set that we as a team are composing.
So we are coming up on 15 minutes past where we expected that we were going to wrap up. I want to throw everybody's attention real quick to the chat, because Duncan has posted a grading scale based on glyphs that y'all can kind of take a look at and download so you don't lose it when the chat is gone. But I want to like super quick wrap up. Thank everybody for being here. We've had a lot of questions come in, but we're also just like running short on time. So we should possibly continue the conversation another time. I think this is a conversation that's never gonna get actually solved, which is why we're here. So.
And thank you all so much for trusting me with your time and trusting us with your time for the last hour. It's been awesome. I've learned a lot, and I've talked a lot.
Thanks for coming and talking, Flan.
Likewise, I definitely talk too much, but I hope it was helpful and productive to some people. Yeah, very grateful to have been asked on this panel, and hope to see all of y'all's proposals and evolutions of how, because that's what it's going to take. That's another point, is if we want shift in this space, if we want things to get better, individual things you do in your gym that can serve as a first point to move forward is valuable. And opening up that conversation and accepting more complexity, I think, is, bear in mind that all of y'all make climbing literally. Like, yeah, I'm quite married to that concept and that idea. You guys make climbing, and in doing so, have a lot of control, but also a lot of responsibility. And let's take it to new places. I think climbing is a material that has a lot of elasticity in it, and it's a complex and complicated sport which suits our time and our generation. So I think it's cool. Let's not stay in the binary thinking of how things were done in the past, this number, that number, and let's try and expand it and explode it to the level of complexity that humans naturally are. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.